class, I live and breathe. Yeah. Yep, yeah, that's what I've been doing.
Yes, yes.
I'll be here.
And so that's been very helpful. So, but I do urge you to come to review with questions. The other thing is, I put up a note on my CR yesterday afternoon. Did anyone notice it about the main topics on the exam? Did you see that? Yes. Okay. So what I did is, look on my CR under announcements, and what I did is I put up the main topics. In other words, in the study guide, there's maybe a whole paragraph about some topic, but I took a question out of one part of that paragraph. So I called that the main topic.
Mm-hmm.
And what I said was that the majority of the questions on the exam are on those main topics that I just put on my CR yesterday. So look at that, and focus on those. But there are a couple of questions that aren't on my little main topic thing. That are on the study guide, of course. So do go through the study guide and make sure you know everything on the study, or try to know as much as you can on the study guide. Concentrate on the main topics that I put on that little announcement from yesterday. That should help a lot. I hope. Again, email me with questions.
We have. Yeah.
Am I going to be? So the review questions. Is that what you're saying? Because someone asked me about that. What I did, instead of giving you the review study questions or whatever I did last time, what I did is I put those main topics up. And the reason I did that is I figured if you see those main topics, you can write your own review questions from that, or study questions from that. Mm-hmm. Because hint, what I put on there in the announcements under main topics, the questions are on those exact topics. So as I said, if there's a whole
it's in the study guide.
And there's one sentence, and that one sentence is on the main topic segment. That'll be the main part of the question. In other words, that'll really cover pretty much mostly everything, except that not every single thing I put on there. Every single thing is on the main topic, but the majority of the test is the vast majority. So, did I make it myself at all clear or totally clear now? I don't know. Yes.
What's the layout of this?
This one is mostly, and I put this on the study. I put on the announcement thing. It's mostly discuss, explain, tell me about.
Or less than first step?
It's more like the first steps. Yeah. So the majority of it will be that. There is a pedigree. Because we did cover pedigrees right after that last midterm. So there's a pedigree, and I'll even tell you what the pedigree is about. The pedigree is about. I give you the pedigree, and I show you the who has the trait and who doesn't have the trait, and then from the pedigree, you're supposed to determine whether it's an autosomal dominant trait or autosomal recessive trait, and why. And I think it's pretty straightforward. But don't forget the why part. And it's not going to be, you have to write 17 paragraphs to explain why. Just one or two sentences should explain why. But okay, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What else is there? I don't know. Yeah.
We have a lab exam from Colette, don't we?
Yes, this week. And I'm doing a lab exam in my other labs too. Yeah.
That's just based on what we learned in the lab.
That's lab. Yeah.
So we take all the quizzes from lab.
But of course, the labs and lectures we've been doing a lot.
Yeah, they're kind of the same thing.
Except that my lecture exam is not cumulative for my lab exam is.
Yes, yeah, that's.
Now, did Colette let you use a study cheat sheet in your lab exam? Because I did in mine.
No.
Wait, are we allowed to?
Well, you better find out for sure.
Yeah, it's tomorrow.
You guys went to class and listened.
Yeah, I see you're supposed to go to class.
I did.
So wait, what did she say?
One section is one.
Wait, what?
One section, we talked about it. That was a certain stage. She said, okay, so the Tuesday didn't bother about it, so she's not starting for one page.
Wait. So the Tuesday lab doesn't get one? Okay, well, it looks like the Tuesday lab doesn't get. I'm not responsible for this. Thursday lab, we're obviously. Yeah, I'd email Colette and find out for sure. I mean, I did let I'm letting my students do it, but my lab students. If you're in a Tuesday lab in Colette's class, I would suggest you email her and find out whether she's allowed you to use the page.
Either that or find every quiz we
But I
took.
don't know the answer to your question. That's a good question.
Yeah.
No
But
question.
this last Thursday, I asked her for sure, and she said, "Oh yeah, I guess I should remember the things that I promised." So she said yes, but she
But
just
that was for the
forgot that
Thursday.
she had said yes, and then she said,
I think maybe all of you should email her, or several of you should email her and ask her to put an announcement up on MyCR to find out for sure. Louder, louder. Well, she's busy with classes, but if you would email her and say, would you make an announcement on MyCR about whether or not a study, sheet or whatever you call it is allowed, she will. I mean, she definitely will.
So is this for like a cheat sheet?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not giving one for this exam. This is not. There's no cheat sheet for this exam. Okay, this is open mind, but not open.
Well,
mind.
Acker's the first person ever let me have answers to a test. So okay.
But in the lab exam, I was letting my students do it, and I just didn't know if Colette was. But I haven't seen her exam. Maybe a totally
It's
different.
50 questions on one. 50
questions?
questions. She said we had 10 exams. It's gonna be probably 5 from each one.
Oh, I see. Okay. That makes some sense. Anyway, we've got to get going with lecture.
Yep, let's do it.
We're doing diversity, more diversity of life. And 2 topics today, fungi and plants. And by the way, they're not related, as I said before. Just because we're putting them together doesn't mean that they're related. They're not particularly related. So I'll start
Fungi
with
doesn't photosynthesize, right?
fungi do not photosynthesize exactly. And so we'll talk about just fungi in general, and then we'll talk about, so in general, we'll talk about them. And I'll talk about diseases, usefulness. And I'll talk about lichens, which are composite organisms. Okay, and then we'll talk about plants. We'll talk about types of plants. This is going to be a real brief, obviously, real brief survey. Oh my God, let's leave it that way. We're talking about not much of an outline for plants. Well, I will say more than that. What it looks like. But anyway, let me start with fungi. They were kind of a problem at first. They weren't sure how to classify them. Because, mushrooms, as I said to you last time, they kind of look like they're plants where they stick up out of the ground, but yet they're not green. They don't photosynthesize. Well, they're in their whole separate category. And fungi. Let's do fungi over here. Fungi include molds and yeasts and mushrooms. Okay. And by the way, you've heard the word toadstool. I think there's no difference in toadstool and mold. I'm not sure what they certain things they call toadstools, certain things they call mushrooms, but really they amount to the same thing.
Toadstools are generally the ones that are poisonous, so you don't eat them.
Well, I don't think that's. I think they use that term for other things than amanita, but I don't think it's just because they're poisonous. Anyway, I'm not sure.
Destroying Angel is generally a toadstool too.
Because I don't really know for sure.
I'm not a mycologist.
Fungi is a huge. Well, I said mycology is the study of fungi, and that's a huge. It's a huge discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I would not want to go out hunting mushrooms on my own because I do not know enough about mushrooms. I definitely urge you not to just eat any old mushroom you see. unless you know what you're eating, because there's some wonderful mushrooms in this county for eating. They're really very tasty ones. But you need to know you're eating the right ones, because there's some terribly poisonous ones too, and you don't want to make a mistake. So anyway, and there are several bunch of people in this area who are real experts, and they all have their own little special places to go mushroom hunting. They won't tell you where they are. Probably make you wear a blindfold before they take you there. I don't know.
Wherever the fairy rings, because they don't want you to ruin it. Yeah.
No, they don't want you to eat all the good mushrooms. But anyway, so but what's the deal on mushrooms? First of all, let me just say something that we talk about food spoiling, right? Well, what is the spoiling of food? What does it mean for food to spoil?
It means that it's
Say it again. Bacterial or fungi. Back breakdown. In other words, if bacteria or fungi, land on the food, they start metabolizing. They'll digest the various products. They also give off a lot of byproducts, which might taste bad or might smell bad or whatever. They also cause some of the breakdown of, like in the vegetables, and so they get all soft and mushy. So they're not appealing. Sometimes you could eat the spoiled food; it wouldn't hurt you. Sometimes there might be some products that various bacteria or fungi put out that might, cause some stomach problems. So anyway, most of us don't want to eat the spoiled food because it's not appealing and we're not used to it. But keep in mind that, say, 100 years or more ago, they didn't know what was really causing food to spoil, particularly, and it was common to eat spoiled food. You walk into a person's house and you could smell meat that was old and rotting or whatever, just because, they didn't have refrigeration. It wasn't until the advent of refrigeration that you could keep food for longer than a few days. Think about milk. How long does it take for milk to spoil if it's sitting out? Not very long.
yeah.
But of course, they did learn techniques to use food in ways that would let it be preserved, such as making cheese. Cheese can last for months, maybe.
Or salting
and
jerky.
use a lot of salt to like salt.
Curing ham.
And pickling. You just learn how to pickle, and fermented products will last a long time. So whatever, they learn these things, but a lot of it's fungal breakdown or bacterial breakdown. Both of these things will do it. Fungi. Well, most fungi are multicellular, although except for yeast, these are multicellular usually. Whereas yeast are unicellular. Multi again. And these guys are they don't they need to they don't photosynthesize, so they need to get preformed food and eat it, digest it, and eat it. So need preformed food. As do we. The same as us, right? Okay. Let's talk just real briefly. Oh gosh, I'll say something about this. Fungi are made of slender, sort of tube-like filaments called hyphae. Each one's a hypha. The plural is hyphae. Are made slender filaments. And then the hyphae make up this branching web, and you've all seen this when you look at molds. You see all those branching of these little branching filaments, and that the branching web is called the mycelium.
Mm-hmm.
Which make up a branching web. Called a mycelium. All right. When we look at a mushroom that's sticking up above the ground, But with mushrooms, the mycelium is under the ground, and it's branching under the ground. You don't see it, and then suddenly it'll stick up every so often. It'll stick up this part that comes up above the ground. That's what we call the mushroom. This is just sort of interesting, so I'm going to put it in here. In a mushroom, the mycelium is underground. And I remember reading years ago somewhere it's in Michigan or something where they found some fungus, and the mycelium was huge. It was just extending over this giant area underground. I mean, you couldn't see it, and they were trying to kind of trace it, and they figured it was one of the largest organisms around
in the world,
because there's incredibly extensive mycelium underground, but you don't see it ordinarily. But what comes up is the mushroom that comes up above ground. Those are the reproductive structures. The mushroom is above ground, or grows above ground. And is the reproductive structure. So, and of course it has, you see this nice little mushroom comes up in a stalk. There's this nice mushroom, and then there are all the spores underneath, and after a certain amount of time, the spores are given off, and presumably the wind is going to blow those spores all around. It's an area that's nice, so it can then start its whole reproductive system again. And by the way, the mushroom would be called the fruiting body. We talked about we used that word the other day with the slime mold. It's just fruiting body, meaning that's the part that's going to produce the spores and allow the species to be spread around. A lot of you maybe have made spore prints taking mushrooms. It's a common thing to do. You take the cap of the mushroom, you put it on a piece of paper, and after a while all the spores are given off, and you get this nice spore print from mushrooms. It's kind of a cool thing to do if you've never done it. But anyway, a lot of those spores. Anyway, that's just a very brief thing about fungi. What I wanted to do is say a little bit about fungal diseases of humans, just because we don't think about those too often. But there's some nasty ones, some really nasty fungal diseases. So let me talk a little bit about that. There's some that are very just annoying. The surface ones are very annoying. But let's talk about fungal diseases. Well, I was going to say that I have some number here. I think I have a percentage or something. Maybe I don't. No, I don't. Okay, never mind. I was going to say how fungi have caused a lot of. Well, I just have rye fungus, but I was going to say somewhere I thought I had something in here about how fungal diseases. I'm going to talk about humans specifically, but of plants. The fungi have caused huge problems in plants all around the world at different times, and some really nasty diseases, wiping out all kinds of plants. So they can have some very destructive effects. We're also going to talk a little bit about the useful effects of fungi. I don't want you to think that all fungi are bad. And the same thing, I don't want you to think all bacteria are bad. Some are bad, some cause diseases, but some are very useful. The same thing is true of bacteria, same thing is true of fungi. So I want to talk a little bit about diseases, but I also want to talk a little bit about how they can be useful. Rather than talk about fungal diseases that destroy crops, which can happen and it's not very good, let's just talk about human diseases. So we say of humans. So, for example, yeast infections. So this vaginal yeast infections. These are just a few of the diseases. I didn't even mention like thrush. Little babies sometimes get a yeast infection in their mouth. Yeah. It's called thrush. So same sort of a thing. skin and nail infections. Now, these are not life-threatening kinds of infections. These are a nuisance more than anything else.
Was it ringworm?
Ringworm, yeah, I was going to use those. Actually, what I was going to talk about. For example, ringworm. I was going to tell you a story, actually, because I think it's kind of funny. Ringworm. And you can get ringworm of the scalp, ringworm of the skin. But ringworm, it's called ringworm. As a kid, we thought it was worms.
Yeah, it's not.
But it's called ringworm because it'll get into the skin, say, okay, and then when it grows, so it started in the say right in one little spot, but then it grows outwards like this. So after a few days, it'll be like this, and a few days later, it'll be. I'm exaggerating how fast it's growing, but what I'm saying is it grows outwards. But where it's growing, there's the yeast are growing. I mean, the fungi are growing there, and there's what you call induration, meaning there's your body is trying to fight it, and so there's a lot of fluid and white blood cells and things like that. So it's swollen. So if you actually look at it, on the skin, here's a ring, and that little ring is swollen. It's flat here, it's flat all the way around, but right where those bugs are, the bacteria, the fungi, they're not bugs. I'm saying bugs, but they're fungi. But right where they are, that little ring, they're all swollen. So it looks like there's an actual, like a worm or something like that inside. It's not. It's the actual fungus, but it looks like a worm. So now, I have to tell you my story. I went to a lot of schools when I was growing up. My dad was in the Army, so we traveled all over the place. So I went to a lot of schools growing up.
Same.
Not a good thing, but it happened. But at any rate, one of the worst schools I ever went to, actually, happened to be a school in San Francisco. One of the better schools I went to happened to be in San Francisco. So it varies. I'm not saying they're all bad or all good. But this one happened to be bad. And I happened to be in the kindergarten and first grade, so I was a little tiny kid, And so, but the reason why one reason why it was so bad was that they didn't have any grass or dirt to play on. It was all asphalt. And because it was all asphalt, they didn't want the kids to run during PE, or not PE, but I was going to say during recess. You weren't supposed to run because if you ran, you might fall and scrape your leg or knee or elbow or something like that. So we're talking elementary school, and the kids are not allowed to run on the playground. Now, have you ever heard of anything quite so stupid in your life? So anyway, but this is the way it was. Okay. Well, all right. So here's the other part of the story. So and also they always had these. We thought they were little old witches or little old biddies that were out there in the playground watching us. And as soon as you started to run, they'd whistle at you. Don't run in the playground, So and we're only 5, 6 years old, And so there were these giants who went to school there. 5th and 6th graders, right? But when you're only 6 years old, 5th and 6th graders are giants to you, And so there were these giants, and always sometime during the, several times during the semester, each semester, some of those giants would come down with ringworm. Now, how did we know they had ringworm? Well, what they did in ringworm was the scalp. And what they would do in those days is they would shave off the hair. They put on a dye, usually gentian violet. Okay, they put on gentian violet. Then they cut off the bottom of the nylon stocking and put it on top of the head. And the gentian violet was good. It would tend to kill off the fungi. But putting on the top of that nylon stocking kept the skin from flaking off. And the skin that flaked off would have some of the fungus in it. So this was helping they could come to school this way without being contagious, essentially. So here were these, here were these guys, you always knew when they had ringworm, because they always had those shaved heads with a little bottom of a nylon stocking. And of course, we knew that they had ringworm, and of course we just assumed there were worms just coming out of their heads. If you've ever seen pictures of Medusa, you see these snakes. Well, that's kind of what we pictured on these guys. And of course, they would chase us little kids, because they were these big giants, and we were these little tiny kids. Ringworm, they come out. They said, ringworm. We get scared, we take off running. Don't run in the playground. Oh, it's so traumatic. I can't believe it. Jeez, I don't know how I survived it. It was pretty intense. But anyway, ringworm is not a worm. It's a fungus. It's a nuisance. It's not life-threatening or anything else. It's just a nuisance. But there are some serious fungal infections, one of the lung especially, and some of these can actually they can start in the lungs and they can move to other organs from the lungs. The one that's most common in by the way, they mostly are regional. They'll occur in certain regions of the country depending upon the conditions. And the one that's common in California, in the Central Valley, is called valley fever. Okay, it's common in Fresno and Bakersfield and those areas, Government Hills and stuff like that. Also, it occurs in New Mexico and Arizona. Dry places. These things like dry places. And you know, the bug itself is coccidioidomycosis. The fungus itself doesn't really want to cause an infection. That's not where it wants to live. It wants to live in the soil. But there's all this agriculture, all the farming, and so the soil is being
kicked up,
moved around. The wind will blow it, and some of the spores will be blowing around. And if you happen to breathe it, it can get into your lungs. Now, the majority of people who do breathe it and get into lungs will get a flu-like symptoms, and they'll be sick for a week or something like that, but they'll get over it. A small percentage of people who get it will get serious infection, and it can cause death. I mean, it can be so serious it can cause death. Sometimes people have to have part one of a lobe removed or whatever. I mean, it can be really, really serious. So, it's can be very nasty. Some of the other lung infections that occur. Let's see. In the Midwest, there's one. What is it? Not blastomycosis. Is that right? No, histoplasmosis or something like that. I think it's something like that. But there's one that's common in the Midwest. Various other.
Isn't there?
Yeah. I spent my elementary years in the Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And there was one thing in particular that died because he disappeared for so long, and you come back.
Was it valley fever? Do you know?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it can be very, very serious. Yeah, and the problem is they don't have a lot of good drugs to treat the fungal infections. As I said, it's not like the fungus wants to be there, but it gets in your lungs and it has nothing else to do, and so
it's opportunistic.
It sets up this relationship. It's a parasitic relationship, of course, with your lung tissue, and you get very sick. Your immune system responds really strongly to those fungal proteins and everything. So and you get very, very sick. And he actually probably came close to dying, is my guess. And it really
afterwards, until it was more school, he did that in more extended to smaller families.
He did, yeah. I moved to Fresno in high school and went to high school in Fresno. I'm not proud of that fact, but it wasn't my fault. But and so anyway, I once I graduated from high school and I went down to Berkeley. I said, well, I'm never going back to Fresno again except to visit my parents. They're not alive anymore, so I don't go back to Fresno ever again. But the point, and I'm kind of joking about it, it's a great place to live if you have water and want to raise, some kind of crops, because you can grow anything there if you have water. Of course, they don't have any water.
Mm-hmm. Oh well, there's
from up here, of course. But anyway, whatever. Another point. So, and they get terrible pollution. When I was a kid, you could actually see the foothills and the Sierras. Now you're lucky to see the next block because the pollution is so bad down in the Central Valley because nothing moves it away. But anyway, that's all another point. But the point I was going to make. What point was I going to make? Oh, we're still talking about valley fever. When I was a grad student at the medical center in San Francisco, we were talking about fungi, and in one part of the class, and the woman who taught that part said, if anyone wants to have a skin test for valley fever, it's like a skin test for TB. Same idea. It's not the same test because one test for TB, which is a bacterium, other test for valley fever. So they come and test. So I tested. So sure enough, I was positive, which is what I thought I was. I figured I was positive, and I remember not too many months after I moved there, I got sick. And I, in my own mind, I think that's when I contracted valley fever, but it didn't progress to some serious disease. I was able to finally get over it. So otherwise, I'd be like that guy probably. And I know some people that happen to in town. So it's very serious. It can be very serious.
Is that related to any one type of mold or fungus?
It is one particular kind.
Is it botrytis or?
No, it's called coccidioidomycosis. That's it. Imitant. That's his name.
Okay. Because black mold has that same effect. Botrytis. Black mold has had that same effect.
So there are a couple of others. There's starts with A, but it's aspergillus. Yeah,
Aspergillium, yeah.
That can cause. You can get aspergillosis, I think, and that's a fungus, and
Yeah.
the black mold. I don't think it's as common to get it, but yeah. But I don't want to say for sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I just want to mention that because that's kind of bad.
Botrytis from smoking it.
Let's talk about the usefulness of it. So fungi are bad. Oh, I started to say that we don't have any good drugs against fungi. There are some drugs that they use, but they have a lot of side effects themselves. We have a lot of good drugs against bacteria and a few against fungi. But the thing is, what kind of cells are bacteria? Prokaryotic.
Yeah.
And because they're prokaryotic, you can often find drugs that will be specific to act on some difference between the prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cells. And so that way those drugs can just attack the bacteria and not have very many side effects for us. But fungi are eukaryotic. They've got somewhat similar cell walls, cell membranes, and similar ribosomes and similar to everything else. So it's hard to find drugs that don't have some side effects. So it's tough to treat. That's why these are really nasty. I should say they can be really nasty. I'm not trying to scare you. And I knew people that would drive down go through the Central Valley and try to hold their nose the entire trip, which of course you can't do because it's several hours. But the point is that you don't want to go down and just be afraid. You're not necessarily going to get it just because you go through there. You might. It could happen, but it's not likely. It's more likely if you live there for a while, because then you're exposed enough time.
Yeah, just passing by Clausewitz a couple times probably won't get you.
Yeah, just passing through the valley. Most likely, let's say it's very unlikely that you might get it. It's possible, but unlikely.
You can install a program on cabin air filters.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. And you could probably filter out the spores. Yeah. But anyway, all right. Let's talk a little bit about some of the way we use fungus usefulness. Fungi. We use them, and especially
food.
Yeast in this case, we use them for making beer, wine, bread, and we use the same yeast, the one we used in the lab for that fermentation experiment. Remember, these are eukaryotic organisms. The yeasts. These are using yeast, right? Saccharomyces. What's a Spanish word for beer?
Cerveza.
Cerveza. And the yeast's name is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So that's where they get I think they named beer after the yeast. They didn't name the yeast after the beer. Okay, pretty sure. Anyway, the yeasts are eukaryotic. They do respire. But in the conditions of making wine and beer and what we did in our fermentation experiment, they use up the O2 right away, and so then they start to ferment. So they're able to ferment without the oxygen around. And so we use them for making beer and wine and bread. Same yeast. And if you go to I mentioned this I think once before to you, if you go to the store and buy yeast, it's called brewer's yeast. Where they get the yeast to make, they get it from breweries because when they use the brewer's yeast, they use the yeast to make beer, but they have all these yeasts left over, so they dry them, sell them to bread making people, or sell them to whatever the different companies are, Fleischmann's and all those that dry it, put it in packages, so you can make your own bread, or you can make your own wine and beer and everything else. By the way, just for interest sake, not that you need to worry about it unless you're interested, but it's fun. If you ever go down wine tasting, like in Napa or Sonoma counties, or even locally, you go to wine tasting locally, it's the same yeast, but there's a whole bunch of little subspecies of these yeast, or varieties of yeast. And for making all the different wines, different varietals, they want to use a different subspecies for each varietal, so they use the exact yeast they want for the whatever the grape is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a fun thing because of that. And they'll talk about it in some of the, if you take the wine tours, and sometimes talk about it. It's a real science. And in the old days, you know, how they make wine, and I told you about
It was just the
way back
yeast
one
on
of
the
early
grapes.
lectures, but you know, they would stomp the grapes, press the grapes, and it would start fermenting. They didn't know how, as I mentioned to you way back then. Natural yeast, there are all kinds of natural yeast on the skin of the grapes. And up until just a few years ago, even most of the French wineries would do it that way, just use the natural yeast. But some years they get a good product, and some years they wouldn't. So, whereas California, years ago, they decided we're not going to take chances. What they'll do is they kill off the natural yeast and they add back just the variety of yeast they want for whatever wine they're making. That way, they're assured of a good product every year. I think most of the French wineries have come to that method now also. I'm actually positive that most have, but I know a lot of them have. Again, it's a matter of whether you want to take a chance on the natural product versus making sure. And
That's what the
of them want to make
inoculation.
sure because there's a lot of money involved.
They inoculated with yeast because that was
Yeah.
I mean, I used to live in Sonoma next door to a wine vineyard, and they said that they would. I thought it was some kind. I didn't know it was fungus. It's yeast.
Yeast,
They would treat them each time to make sure that they get the right kind
right.
of.
That you use I don't know what they use to kill off all
The other stuff, yeah.
The other thing is that no matter what the grape looks like, grape juice is clear.
Uh-huh.
How do you get a red wine or the pink, you know, the blush or something like that? The color is in the skin. Okay.
The pigments in the
And
skin.
and the pigments that are in the skin are alcohol soluble. So if you want a white wine, you press the grape and you get just the juice, and then you put the yeast in there to let it ferment. If you want a red wine, you crush the grapes, you add the yeast you want, but you leave the skins in. And then as the fermentation goes and alcohol starts being made, it'll extract the color from the skin. And the longer you leave the grape skins in, the more pigment gets extracted. So if you leave it in a little tiny bit of time, you get what they call blush, or what is it?
Rosé.
What do they call it?
Rosé.
Rosé, or what's the other one called? You know, pink.
Chablis. Those are the ones that are.
Like pink. What is it? Yeah, like a pink Zen or something like that.
Oh.
They're just leaving the skin in for a little bit of time, so you're getting just a little bit of color. If you want a regular Zinfandel, you leave the skin in a long time, get it. And the more skin you leave in, you know, it's just a little different flavor than the outside. So there's a real science to this whole thing. So it's pretty amazing. And it's fun. I mean, it's kind of fun. It's fun to go wine tasting. Don't drive if you're doing it. Just walk or take your bicycle. I don't know. No, it's fun. It's fun to go.
Everybody drives to Napa to do it, though.
Of course, but have a designated driver with you. But the ones I really love, I have to admit, my favorite are the champagnes. Now, by law, international law, to call it champagne,
You have to pay
it
France.
has to be made in the Champagne region of France. But you might notice that California sells champagne made here.
Sparkling
They
wine.
didn't sign the international law. However, most of I think pretty much if they try to export it, they will call it a sparkling wine. They won't call it champagne. But selling it in the United States, they'll call it champagne. But if you notice, if you go to several of the big French champagne makers that came over here and bought property in Napa Valley, for example, and started making champagne over here. But when they make it over here, they call it sparkling wine. They don't call it champagne. And one of the big ones is Moet et Chandon. And you look at that, you go, if you speak French, you go, shouldn't it be Moet et Chandon? No, it's Moet et Chandon, because the person named Moet wasn't French, they were Belgian.
Moet et Chandon.
So they'll tell you all this if you take their tour. It's a great tour, by the way, and it's a great product. So just so you know these things.
Is that even a good champagne? I'm not a big fan of.
It's very expensive champagne.
I get that.
It is
Well,
very good.
it's referenced in a Queen song, but
It's very expensive. Yes, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
Most of us can't drink that very often. That's for sure. But it's a wonderful product. Anyway, but it's all fun stuff. But to make a champagne, you have to make first the wine in a regular fermentation. Then you put that wine into after a certain amount of time of doing it. You then put the wine that you've made into separate bottles, and then you add some more yeast. So you do a second fermentation in the bottle, and so that's how you get all the bubbles in there. And what they'll tell you, you go through their tour, and they say, don't just take the top of the champagne bottle off and boom, let it pop out there, and burble all over the place. We went to a lot of trouble to put these bubbles in here. You go to a lot of trouble to keep them in when you go to drink it. So, first of all, the cap, 6 1/4 turns, 6 3/4 turns, industry standard. So if you take the cap off, you turn it 6 3/4 times. Then you take the cap off, and you very carefully turn the bottle. You're supposed to turn the bottle, not the top. Turn the bottle, holding the cork, and then you slowly let the air out. So you don't just have it bursting out and losing all the bubbles, because that's the whole idea. You want those bubbles. And by the way, you talk to ophthalmologists, there is a condition in ophthalmology called cork eye. For people opening the same, boop, and hitting them at high pressure, and that's not good. You can cause some severe damage. And it's actually called cork eye, just so you know this. So be very careful, but you hold on to that cork so you slowly, people think it's great to pop it, but slowly let the bubbles out. Then you can pour it. Anyway, whatever. And by the way, you might notice those bottles, they're really strong bottles because they have racks of these bottles, and if one bottle broke, it could break a bunch around it, so they're very careful. And they also put a little mark on the bottom, and every day they turn a quarter of a turn. And you have people that would just come by turning these things a quarter turn every day. Now they do it by machine.
wow.
Yeah, they're doing a great job, right? Anyway, let's go on. I wasn't going to talk about all this stuff. It's fun stuff. Okay, what are some other things we get? Antibiotics. A lot of antibiotics. Many antibiotics come from fungi. The very first one, penicillin. They found that one way back in 1929. Although they couldn't get it into a usable form until about 1943. I think it was 41, 2, 3, something during the Second World War. But it was kind of found by accident. But fungi that make the product, the name of the fungus is Penicillium, and so the drug they get from it's called penicillin, and it can inhibit a lot of different bacteria. So that's a very good thing. Oh, now in blue cheese. What they do with the blue cheese, and in the particular area of France is called Roquefort. So Roquefort is what they call it if it's made in Roquefort area of France, and if it's made anywhere else, you have to call it blue cheese. It's the same stuff, of course, but what they do is you make your cheese, and then they take this fungus, and it's a blue mold. It's actually, I think, a penicillium type mold, but they inject it every so often, and then that gives certain flavors to the cheese, and that's
delicious.
Blue cheese. Yeah.
In parts of Italy, they used to leave it out and let flies lay eggs and maggots crawl through it, and you get it's a really good.
And by letting the maggots crawl through it,
They're just digesting it, I guess.
Right, digesting the
cheese.
The cheese, and
they're getting the maggots of the pit.
And getting but this wasn't necessarily blue cheese, was it? I mean, just for the blue cheese, so they got extra special flavors from the maggot digestion.
I thought that was Stilton.
Really
Stilton is
tasty to
basically
me.
the same
Actually,
thing.
maggots, by the way, that's the interesting thing which you mentioned just real quickly. Before antibiotics, what they used to do with wounds is they would put fly eggs on it. And
because it will clean it.
The maggots will eat the bacteria and all that. They'll eat some of the dead flesh and the bacteria. And so that they could actually clean up
sterilize
the
your wound, yeah.
And so now of course we use antibiotics. right. But I
Still
mean,
use
okay, they
maggots.
use.
I heard in some hospitals they still will use maggot.
Because
They
they're
may.
They culture their own sterile.
Oh yeah, they culture. They don't just use
Oh,
here's a
yeah.
fly out of
Yeah.
there. Yeah, right. Well, here's a once landing on some dog fur.
because
No. Yeah.
if you have drug, yeah.
Penicillin, what are you allergic to?
Well, it is a fungal product, and so you exactly what you're allergic to, I don't know. But it's about 10% of the population will be allergic to penicillin. Just don't take any of the cillins, because they take penicillin in a lot of varieties of it.
Blue cheese affect you?
But I don't know exactly. It's a good question. I don't know what it is, but some part of it, some part of the molecule. Or maybe there are even some little fungal products that aren't quite purified away from it. It's pretty pure stuff, so it's probably just a penicillin. So
Would the blue cheese affect you? If you're allergic to penicillin?
probably not. If it's penicillin, because the amount of this particular species that they use, I think, is so tiny.
I was going to say that
I don't
would
think
really
so. But if
suck.
are you allergic, by the way? Do you know? Have you ever had blue cheese?
No, yeah, I have.
And it didn't bother you, right? Yeah. But anyway, I my guess is it's such a tiny quantity it wouldn't happen. Real quickly, let's talk about. I want to talk about this. What lichens are. Lichens are an interesting organism because it's a composite organism. And I think if you look on the announcements I put on my CR, I think it said, look at lichens, look at composite organisms. So, hint, pay close attention right now to this lecture, this part of the lecture.
Yeah, that guy's paying attention.
Lichens, a composite organism, or again, I'll call it organism. It's made of two different parts. Made of 90% are made of fungus and alga. Remember, that's a singular of algae, and that's those are both prokaryotic organisms. About 10% of lichens are made of a fungus and a blue-green. Okay. But look at this, two different organisms, but what's the difference between either the alga and blue-green or compared to the fungus? What's the word?
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis. So here's the thing. By being made of the two different kinds of organisms, they're helping each other. So where lichens can live on all kinds of unusual sorts of circumstances, like maybe on rocks. Now, plants not going to live on a rock. There's nothing to eat, nothing. Can't put its roots down there. But what the fungus does is it provides support. The fungus can provide support. Let's write this down. It provides support and moisture. And of course, the blue-green or the alga can provide the photosynthesis. It provides food. And the fungus might provide some minerals. I should provide support, moisture, minerals. And the alga or blue-green, photosynthesis does photosynthesis. So it gives a place to live. And so it can provide, sugar, food, for the fungus. So they're helping each other out. So they can live in areas that wouldn't be, like an alga wouldn't be able just to live on its own on a plant. It wouldn't be able to stick to it. It wouldn't be able to it would dry out and all that. But having this fungus that kind of helps, support it and surround it and everything, it actually allows it, and attach. It can attach to I'm saying a rock. It doesn't have to be rock. It can be bark of a tree or all kinds of places. But places that wouldn't necessarily be suitable for either one alone. Together, they help each other out. All kinds of different lichens. I'm not good at necessarily recognizing them, but the book has some interesting pictures. But here's the deal. This is sort of an interesting story. The fact that it is a composite organism who was the first person to prove this, to show this? Well, Beatrix Potter. You've heard of Beatrix Potter. She wrote things like The Tale of Peter Rabbit, The Tale of Benjamin Bunny. Didn't some of you hear some of those tales when you were little?
Yeah,
Your mommy and daddy read those to you?
it's a
So
huge issue.
Beatrix Potter is the first person who proved that lichens were this composite organism. She was a natural science, self-taught, and this was right around the turn of the century, 1900s, early 1900s. So she actually had been studying these lichens, and she's the one who proved it. So she actually wrote up a paper, and she wanted it to be presented at the Royal Academy of Science in London. She had 2 strikes against her. The first, of course, was
She's a woman.
female. And the second was she wasn't university trained. She was self-taught. So both of those were bad, in those times. And so they didn't accept her paper. Now, she went on and did all kinds of other works in natural history, and she kept extensive notebooks, and she was a very good natural scientist. But she's most well known now for all her stories, because she used to love to tell these stories, and she was a good artist. She had extensive drawings of all her natural history investigations. But she was a good artist, so she had these nephews and nieces, and she'd tell them these little stories. She'd make up these stories, and somebody in the family said, you should write those stories down, and why don't you draw pictures for us? Because she was a good artist. So she did, and that's what she's now most well known for, of course, are her stories. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because that's kind of a huge problem. Is women were never generally recognized in science, though they taught us how to measure the universe.
Well,
and how to catalog. I mean, there was actually a thing on Cosmos about Pickering we looked in the astronomy textbook. It mentions Pickering, but not them. We're actually writing the publishing company and saying, yeah, you guys are screwed. Yeah, fix this.
It is weird because there's been a lot of prejudice over the years, but this was a very obvious one where they showed that she came up with it first. There's no doubt, and so she's given credit now. But it took a while before it was accepted. The last little bit about fungi I'll just mention is that they estimate that maybe as many as 90% of seed plants have some kind of cooperative relationship with fungi. Usually it's with their root nodules. And it helps them, get minerals and water from the soil and all that kind of stuff. And the fungus can sometimes help provide some, carbohydrates for the plant and everything too. So anyway, but the point I'm making is this is a very obvious composite organism. When you're talking about plants, you don't think of it as a composite organism. It's not with the fungus. It's just that the fungus and these plants can have a very effective cooperative arrangement where the fungus can help it out, in terms of the roots and all that for the plant. Anyway, so fungi, they're a fascinating topic of so many different ways. Okay, let's talk. I didn't say much about plants at all. I'm going to say a little bit about plants more than what it says there. Let's just talk about plants. Plants. They think that plants were, evolved from, green algae that started to, get onto land, and now, of course, plants are absolutely critical for things like food, for all kinds of organisms, including ourselves, and oxygen in the atmosphere. Now, keep in mind that, the oxygen in the atmosphere probably is 60% or so from marine algae and from blue-greens, but it could be as much as 50% and 50% plants. We tend to think, if you think about it, you say plants, they're providing the oxygen for the atmosphere, but at most probably 50%. I'm not downgrading plants, I just want you to realize it's not just plants that are providing oxygen, but they're very important. But they all have chloroplasts, and so they photosynthesize. And give off oxygen, of course. So, okay, well, I guess I was thinking something to say, but I guess I really want to say this. So they all have cell walls. By the way, I didn't mention this in the fungi. Fungi have cell walls too, but they're made differently from the cell walls of plants. And the cell walls are mostly cellulose plus lignin. These are just
sugar and
lignin is I forget exactly what it is. I think it is a polysaccharide. Cellulose definitely is a polysaccharide. I think lignin is a polysaccharide also. But lignin especially gives strength for things like trees, so they grow really tall. And the other things that they have, is this alternation of generations. I'm not going to be going into any of this. I hope that maybe for you guys, that maybe Colette did. Maybe she mentioned. I don't know if she did not, but she's a botanist, so she can tell you a lot more about it than I can. I can't tell you much. But it's interesting that if you look at animals, we're diploid, right?
mm-hmm.
Now our gametes are haploid, and the gametes get together to form a diploid zygote, which then grows into a diploid organism. But what happens with plants is they have this alternation of generations where for part of the time they'll be haploid, and then diploid, then haploid,
Alternating?
Yeah, they alternate. And, you can read this, and I'll say, etc. And I'm not going to make a big deal about it, and I don't even pretend that I can remember it. I've studied in the past, but I really don't remember the details, so I'm not even going to pretend that I can tell you about it, other than they do this. And, but they'll go into this haploid state, and then they'll be reproducing. But they'll spend a lot of time in the haploid state. Some plants spend more time in the haploid state than they do in the diploid. Others spend more time in the diploid state than the haploid. So it does vary. There's no rule. What I'm more interested in is just the four kinds of plants, the old way that they used to divide it, and it kind of goes from more primitive to more modern. We can say it that way. And so let's talk about that. And what I want you to think about, just some of the things that would help these plants, or help the different ones as they're, say, evolving and wanting to survive in the conditions of on land. Because remember, green algae were marine organisms, and then presumably started to invade the land slowly. But in order to invade the land, you have to have certain ways to allow you to survive. You don't want to just dry out and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's the kind of thing I want you to think about. Let's look at these. The first group is called the bryophytes. We'll talk about each of these in very brief, but just I'll mention the bryophytes, then the seedless vascular plants. Bryophytes are called non-vascular plants. And then we have the seedless vascular plants. And then the gymnosperms. And then the angiosperms. The last two are the ones we're most familiar with, but you will some of these other things. Let's do these. Now, so we have arteries and veins, right? The arteries are pumping the blood, away from the heart, taking blood away from the heart. The veins are bringing blood back to the heart, But it's pumping, the heart's pumping this blood so it's going throughout the body. Well, the bryophytes, the other three, number 2, 3, and 4 here, they all have this vascular tissue that allows the movement of things like the water. It's also allowing the movement of things like the sugar and everything that's made in photosynthesis, and it allows it to be moved through the plant. So the bryophytes don't have this vascular tissue, okay? So the bryophytes, these are things like what they call the liver mosses. Well, you know about mosses, liverworts. Some others called hornworts, but they don't get very tall. They're probably relatives of some of the earliest plants that invaded, that I should say formed after the invasion of the land. They're probably really early. And so we think of these as the most primitive. Now, you have to be careful in using terms like primitive and all that, because obviously they are existing today, and we're existing today. Does that mean that we're more, and if I say they're more primitive, does that mean that we're more advanced? Well, things have changed over the years. Obviously, they're very well suited for their lifestyle. But their lifestyle is more similar to what things were way back then, in the early days. So they're very similar, probably similar to some of the earliest plants. We don't get very tall, but of course, if you get tall, I mean, we're talking plants here, but if you get tall off the ground, you're going to need to get things like you need to get things like the sugar in the water to be able to move around, so you can get it from get the water safe from the soil and get it up to where the leaves are and everything. But if you don't have the vascular tissue, it's not so easy to get there. So you can imagine they don't get very tall. They don't get very far off the ground. Does that make sense?
Mm.
Because you would have trouble getting, water to all the different parts of the plant. You'd have trouble getting, moving some of the sugar around. So they don't get very tall. The other thing is they need water for the sperm to get the eggs. Now that's going to be true for the seedless vascular plant, but it's not going to be true for the last two. We don't need the water anymore. So this is kind of if you look at this, you say, hey, this certainly seems, more like the way it would have been in the early days, before the plants that invaded the land. Everything's in the water, so you expect sperm to be made and float
freely,
to the eggs. Does that make sense? What
Yeah.
I'm saying? Okay, so those are the bryophytes. The seedless vascular plants are like ferns. Again, we're very familiar with those around here.
Mm-hmm.
And these have a vascular system, so they can grow higher off the ground, and they have more of a root system, so they have true vascular system. And a more elaborate root system. So again, you think, well, that's good, because then they can grow taller. And of course, they've got that vascular system, so they can move with water, nutrients, and everything, around. But they still need water for the sperm to get the eggs. They still need water. So that's kind of and I said that's not going to be true for the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. You don't need the water anymore. So it's kind of in between. Sort of, you can see kind of a progression in what we would think of as more complex and I don't know, modern. I use that word, but I'm using it reservedly or regardedly or whatever. Okay, so anyway, so those are the seedless vasculars. Now, the gymnosperms, of course, we're very familiar with those around here. These are the conifers. These are the redwoods and the firs and the you know what I'm trying to say? The trees. Say it again. The trees. Trees are trees. Yeah, trees. But I said the redwoods and the
Conifers.
and the firs and what do you call it? What's the other ones? Pines. That's it. Thank you. Just blanking. That's all. Gymnosperms. These are the conifers. Most are the conifers. Most. These are redwoods.
Trees like ginkgo trees.
Now, ginkgo is a really old plant. It's been around a long time. What is it? I don't. Is it a? It's a gymnosperm, I think, is it not? And
Why?
but it's really old. I mean, that goes back way back when. Yeah, I don't know much about. As I said, anything you want to ask about
Plants. Yeah.
plants, ask Colette. She's far more knowledgeable about that than I am. That's her field is botany. But anyway, redwoods, pines, firs. Okay, so these are the gymnosperms. Now, what do these guys have? All these things have pine cones.
They're conifers. Yeah.
They have these pine cones. So, so the here's the idea here. The sperm. This is what I want you to see the difference here. You don't need the water. Sperm are in pollen grains, and then the wind will, you know, when the pollen goes off, the wind will blow this around. Now you've seen, I remember one day my car was covered with all this yellow pollen from, I don't know, fern or pine, whichever one it was, but all over the place. They just, you know, these pollen grains just are given off in huge numbers. And what happens is the wind blows them, and then so they're transported to the air and to the pine cone, and in the pine cone are the female reproductive structures that where the eggs are. So the sperm and pollen grains blown by the wind to pine cones, which have the female reproductive structures. Meaning eggs and stuff. Of course, they form the eggs. Now, the other thing is that then when they fertilize, and when the eggs are fertilized, when eggs are fertilized, they develop into what's called an embryo when eggs are fertilized. Into an embryo. Develop into an embryo. And of course, in that, and then the and then, you know, and then it doesn't. So then we get a seed, embryo, okay, embryo, forming a seed. But the difference here is that the seed doesn't have any covering the way it will in the angiosperms. Okay, but no covering by fruit. Okay, so again, just look at the difference in terms of the reproduction. You don't need water. You need water for both the bryophytes and the seedless vascular plants for the sperm to reach the eggs. But in this case,
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind.
The answer is blowing in the wind. Exactly. Yes, that's it. And but then we'll see. The other thing is, so we'll see the little difference here. Obviously, the angiosperms, you know more about those anyway, but we'll talk about them. But and then the seed that's formed is plain. I mean, kind of more or less plain. Now the seed contains nutrition. This is kind of important thing. Seeds contain nutrition. And of course, that nutrition is necessary. Well, it's nutrition, contain nutrition, and I should say, are for protection of the embryo. Okay, so that's kind of important because the seed is given off. It's going to be traveling around again by the wind and all that, landing somewhere. To begin with, if it does get into a place in the soil or wherever where it might be necessary to grow, you need that nutrition for the initial development of the root system and the stalk and everything before it has a chance to photosynthesize, right? So that's what is happening with that seed, and you've got a seed coat which gives protection to it and all that sort of stuff. All right, angiosperms. Let's talk about the angiosperms. These are the flowering plants.
The fruits.
A little weird.
And they trick organisms into doing it for them.
Say it again.
They said this is the ones that trick organisms into pollinating for them.
I couldn't understand.
These are the ones that trick other organisms
Oh, yeah.
into like bees and
I
stuff.
guess you say trick them, or they just say they're working cooperatively with each other.
No, they're tricked.
But they do trick them in the sense that they have something to attract. They have the nectar or whatever.
Yeah.
Something to eat it, an insect or other animals.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the angiosperms are the flowering plants. But these include things like roses and all that, obvious flowers, but it also includes the food crops too.
Because those are flowers.
Also including trees. I say most trees, other than all the conifer most trees, and we'll say food crops.
Apples.
Okay, but in this case, the seed is surrounded by fruit. Now, if we're thinking of things like peaches and apples and all that, the fruit's obvious. But still, even if we're thinking of food crops, it's not quite the same idea. But you can see that it's still got this nice nutritious kind of seed that's very useful to any animal that might eat it. What about the pollination? In the case of the pollination, as you know, pollination by insects,
Birds.
Mammals,
Mm-hmm.
depending upon the plant. And they tend to have things like nectar or fancy coloration, something to attract whatever it is that the bee or the bird or whatever, the hummingbird or something like that. They have something that will attract them. The flowers, let's just say they have nectar, good smell, coloration, fruit itself. What was the other one? The fruit itself. And the fruit, yeah. But that's for the seed. But this is for the pollination. What I'm thinking. The seed is got that, so the seed can be transferred somewhere else, by an animal eating and the seed will pass through or something. Nectar gets one of the coloration, etc., to attract the pollinators. By the way, there's a big problem these days with the bees, dying off. There's a real collapse of bees, and of course the bees are critical for pollinating. And some plants and animals are so particular about, I say particular, but specialized is the real word, as far as what insect can pollinate what plant, and what insects won't. So there's some tricky relationships here. A little louder, a little louder.
An interesting thing I learned about this in botany that bees are attracted to blue flowers.
Okay.
And birds are attracted to red flowers.
Okay.
And often, birds don't have a sense of smell at all. So often, the flowers that they're attracted to, won't have a fragrance.
Oh, they don't have any fragrance. Yeah. Okay. But does the fragrance? Is the fragrance good for the bees? Is that attractive? Yeah.
You think of stuff like lavender.
Yeah. Some of the really fragrant ones. Strictly bees. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. So I didn't know that birds didn't have a sense of smell. But,
so that's what happened.
Well, they have a sense of smell. It's not.
But maybe it doesn't work.
It's very underdeveloped.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. That's wild. Okay, the last little part here. Well, not the last little part. Let's talk about the seed. So, seed is very nutritious. Now, I say that you have to be kind of careful because in certain things like in things like rice and wheat, you have to be careful because when I say it's nutritious, a lot of the seeds you wouldn't eat. I mean, you'd eat the fruit, but not the seed. In fact, in many cases, the big fruits, the seeds themselves, some of them have bits of cyanide in them and all that, so that they aren't eaten. So the animal can eat the fruit, but leave the seed, so it may be able to land in some place where it can, start growing again. But in the case of things like rice and wheat, the seed's very nutritious. And I thought I would just mention these terms for you so you can. If you are reading about what's in your bread, for example, whole wheat versus all that kind of stuff. So let me see if I can write this down and make sense out of here. The endosperm. The endosperm is for, let's say in wheat. There's also I think it's true for rice too. But see, we tend to get the really highly what do you call it? What's the word? Processed, wheat and rice and all that. Rice isn't. You get white rice, and of course they've taken a lot of the minerals and vitamins away, so they add those back in. Same thing with wheat. But if you take the more whole type grain, then you get all of it. So let's take for wheat. Okay, for wheat, the endosperm. I just think this is kind of interesting. Endosperm surrounds the embryo, and then and the embryo is called the wheat germ. So the whole grain. You're talking about the whole grain wheat. Then you're talking about you still have the embryo, and that's what's called wheat germ. And then the seed coat equals the bran. So wheat bran, that's the seed coat, and then the rest of the seed. If you're talking about whole grain, then it's the seed. This is the endosperm and the embryo. If you're talking about just regular stuff, then they polish away the embryo and the seed coat. You're just getting
the bran.
The endosperm still is healthy, but it's a lot healthier. I'm sorry, you're just getting the embryo. No, you're just getting endosperm. But if you get the whole grain, you're getting all of it. It's much healthier because you're getting all the vitamins, natural vitamins. Anyway, the last little bit is that what we were just saying about the fruit. The fruit is you know, fruit attracts animals, you know, and then they eat the fruit and, you know, usually pass the seeds out, you know, or just eat the fruit around the seed, and then that helps to transport the seed somewhere else. So fruit attracts animals, which then disperse seeds. Okay, that's kind of the idea. Yeah. Go ahead.
There was some reason plans distributed.
Oh,
Right.
class is over.
And then, yeah. And some of them are so specialized, it's amazing. It's just absolutely, yeah.
There's a type of, I don't know if it's a wolf or
Yeah.
not, but it has this relationship to it's like a tomato plant kind of.
Yeah.
And, it has to eat the tomato plant and it's only able to be fertilized inside.
And the wolf.
So, yeah. I don't know if it's a wolf. But
There's a lot of
But there's
symbiotic
so many
relationships going on. Plant fruit
very
bats and stuff that can
specialized
only certain types can
And you
perpetuate
mess
certain
up one
trees.
part of them.
Yeah.
The ecosystem gets messed up. All right, cool. Just so everybody knows, I might actually post a video going over all the stuff from the quiz that's going to be in lab tomorrow. So if you want, check it out. Since we don't get a cheat sheet, we don't get a cheat sheet, so I'll do something.